They had it all, money and fame.
He was making $600 or $700 a year. She was a darling of the press.
And her murder made headlines.
They just blood all around the place.
She put up quite a struggle.
The vicious attack leaves a bloody trail, but where will it end?
He pursued her. He was surveilling her.
They're going to extremes to prevent anyone from knowing where they were.
We had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
Sarasota, Florida, November 7th, 1997. It's a sunny autumn day in the wealthy seaside town that's home to many snowbirds and retirees. But at 4:20 that Friday afternoon, the city's 911 dispatch center receives a distressing call.
This is the 911 center. What's the matter? Mom. Oh my God. My mom is dead.
Okay, what makes you think that?
There's blood all around the place.
Okay, who else is in the house there?
I have my brothers and sisters.
How old are you?
I'm 13.
This is a teenage girl who's just gotten home from school, and she finds her mother on the kitchen floor, dead.
The daughter had come home from school, and the brothers and sister were wandering around crying, and she found her mother.
Is the person that did this to her still there?
Oh, I don't think
so. Okay. Calm down. We have help on the way.
I was dispatched as the primary unit to respond to the house. And it took me a few minutes to get there, but I ended up going in first.
Inside, police find 13-year-old Stevie Bellish in the kitchen.
She was standing over her mother, who was on the floor. Obvious blood, gunshot wound in the face. She'd been there for a little while. There's definitely no signs of life.
4 small children, bloody and distraught, but apparently unhurt, are also in the room.
First thing that we want to do is clear the residence. I had Stevie go outside and start bringing her siblings outside.
Once the children are outside, police clear the rest of the house.
I started going room to room, making sure that there was no other victims or any of the suspects. Looking under the beds, just looking for anybody that's there to do harm or other victims. Unfortunately, there was none.
The scene secured. Paramedics rush into the kitchen.
Scenes like this, it's pretty tough to forget. It is readily apparent that there was nothing that we were going to be able to do for her.
Stevie Bellish identifies the victim as her mother, 35-year-old Sheila Bellish. Sheila Lee Walsh was born in 1962 in Topeka, Kansas, to an Air Force pilot father and stay-at-home mom.
She lost her father when she was 10. He was shot down in a mission in Vietnam. Sheila's father was more than a role model to her. He was her hero, and she wanted to make him proud. She graduated high school in 1982 and started a job as a receptionist at a local law firm, and that's where she met her future husband, Alan Van Hout. It was kind of a whirlwind romance. He proposed to her on their 3rd date, and 3 months later they were married.
Alan soon became a successful businessman, the owner of a medical supply company in Bend, Oregon.
He had made a lot of money. I believe he was making $600 or $700 a year on that medical equipment business.
Now multi-millionaires, the couple relocated to Hawaii and then to San Antonio, Texas.
Alan actually told me, man, one of the most beautiful times he had was living in Hawaii for 2 years. He actually owned a yacht. He said Hawaii is very expensive, but he loved it. That's like the best place in the world to live.
Somewhere in that same time frame, he changed his name to Alan Blackthorne.
He was just like a playboy. He got money, I think he might have had a 911 Porsche.
In the mid-1980s, the Playboy became a family man. He and Sheila had 2 daughters, but the marriage didn't last.
Everything seemed like it was wonderful until kids come, a lot of stress come, a lot of different moves people make, they not going in the same direction. I mean, hey, that's why things get dissolved.
There had been a divorce. There had been litigation. There had been child support issues.
Sheila eventually received full custody of her 2 daughters. And in 1992, the single mom fell in love with a pharmaceutical salesman named Jamie Bellish. A year later, the couple married.
They really wanted the family. They had some difficulty getting pregnant, so they decided to try IVF treatment, and it ended up working a little too well.
In December 1995, Sheila gave birth to 3 sons and a daughter, and local media dubbed her the Quad Mom.
When she gave birth to the quads, it was a big media event here in San Antonio.
She was kind of a celebrity.
She was a darling of the press. It made a lot of news.
In 1997, the family of 8 relocated to Sarasota, Florida to start a new life.
He got a promotion in the Sarasota, Florida area, and they packed up and moved.
But for Sheila Bellish, it was the beginning of the end. On November 7th, just 6 weeks after leaving Texas, the 35-year-old mother of 6 is found dead in her home, surrounded by her 4 youngest children.
None of them appeared injured, but they did have some blood on them. There was blood on their feet, it was on their hands. Some of them, I recall, it was on their the life vests that they were wearing.
We wondered why the children were in life jackets. It did look like they might have been out by the pool at some point, but we didn't know when or what time that might have occurred. It doesn't appear from the blood spatter that the children were close when this happened. It appears more like the children came to find their mother and were walking around her after she had passed.
Investigators want to know who could do something as horrible as killing a mother while her young children are in the house.
What's the motive? What is the possible motive for anyone to do what they did to her?
Coming up, police take a closer look at Sheila and Jamie's marriage.
Typically, when you have any kind of homicide, you always start with the inner circle, which would be her current husband.
On November 7th, 1997, police find mother of 6, Sheila Bellish, murdered inside her Florida home. The brutality of the crime shocks even the most seasoned investigators.
This was clearly a homicide. She had her throat cut, had a bullet hole in her cheek.
She had some defensive wounds on her hands and arms.
She put up quite a struggle, and to me, that's a mother's instinct. She had those kids there with her, and she was thinking of her kids.
The trail of blood leading from the kitchen suggests the attacks started elsewhere.
Despite severe and ultimately lethal wounds, she actually crawled down a hallway from a utility room.
From where the initial attack had taken place to where Sheila eventually passed away, it was approximately 17 feet.
There were blood splatter marks on the baseboard and somewhat up the wall every few feet. What was happening was she was crawling to get to the phone, and she was collapsing. She'd lost so much blood and was losing blood. She'd collapse every foot or so, and she'd smack on the floor, and it would throw blood up on the wall.
She'd managed to get to the phone and get it off the receiver, off the hook, but she was never able to dial 911. It was an old rotary phone, so anybody who remembers the old rotary phones knows that dialing the 9 is the longest time it takes to dial. And I always did wonder if it had been a push-button phone, if she might have been able to at least get 911 pressed.
Investigators find no sign of forced entry, but the door between the utility room and the garage is open.
It's believed that that door had been unlocked.
In the utility room off the garage, evidence techs find a bloody knife on the floor.
It appeared to be a match to a set of knives that was located in the kitchen on a magnetic rack. The knife had approximately a 7-inch blade.
Investigators also find a .45 caliber shell casing and a bullet hole in the wall.
The shell casing was located in the utility room on top of the washer and dryer.
Since it appears to be where the shooting occurred, crime scene investigators pay special attention to the utility room when processing the house for clues.
We knew for a fact that the suspect had been in those areas. And we did develop a fingerprint on the side of the dryer. They all get submitted to the latent print division of the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office.
But the results will take time.
In 1997, we were doing most of our latent print comparison manually, which meant a human would sit there and do a one-to-one comparison. So it's impossible to just go through the fingerprint files and start doing comparisons like they do now.
Police are also canvassing the neighborhood looking for additional leads.
The neighborhood they lived in was a quiet neighborhood. Most people were retired. Back then, we probably had 5 or 6 homicides a year in Sarasota County. But it wasn't something that would happen in that neighborhood ever. So when it did happen, people were like, everybody talked about it.
Several witnesses did report having seen a man walk around in camouflage clothing and combat boots in the neighborhood, which they seemed to think was unusual.
Finally, investigators turn to Sheila's daughter, Stevie, but the distraught teen has little to give them.
She was the first one to arrive home from school, and she saw her mother laying on the floor, and she made the 911 call.
After talking to a shaken Stevie, investigators turn their attention to the teen's stepfather, who they'll need to eliminate as a suspect.
Typically, when you have any kind of homicide, you always start with the inner circle and work your way outward. So we initially had to start with her current husband, which is Jamie Bellish. And we looked into where he was that day.
He was interviewed by some sheriff's deputies in Sarasota. He was absolutely heartbroken and devastated.
He told us where he was. He was a salesman for pharmaceuticals, so he had different places that he had been that day.
Jamie said he left the house around 7:30 a.m. He stopped and had breakfast, and then he went to Fort Myers to meet with some clients. He left there around 3 p.m., went to meet with a contractor who was working on the new house.
We were able to later, shortly thereafter, verify everywhere he was.
They quickly concluded he had no involvement in it.
However, when investigators ask who might have reason to hurt Sheila, Jamie Bellish suggests that her ex, Alan Blackthorne, might have something to do with Sheila's death.
They had a very rocky marriage. She filed for divorce. He very much resented it, and they fought constantly for at least 10 years.
Jamie says it got so bad that they decided to move away from Texas.
She wanted to get out of Texas because he was always taking her in and out of court, trying to get custody of the kids, and she had about enough of it. So she left Texas and didn't let him know where she was.
I think it was only Sheila's sister that knew where she was, and 1 or 2 very close friends who fully understood that they were not to tell anyone.
Coming up, did the family's disappearance push Alan Blackthorne over the edge?
He had lost, and it became clear that Mr. Blackthorne hated to lose.
In Sarasota, Florida, police investigating the murder of Sheila Bellish have identified a possible suspect, her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne.
They had been fighting back and forth for, could be close to a decade, from the time of the divorce until 1997. And he would file motions for custody or to reduce child support, and She would file motions to restrict his ability to visit his children. She would file motions to increase child support. It went on and on and on and on.
In early 1997, Alan Blackthorne abruptly surrendered.
He shows up and tells his lawyer that he wants to abandon all rights to the children. He wants to surrender his parental rights. He signed essentially documents giving up any parental rights to his children. And that was a loss. That was a big loss.
While Sheila and Jamie were happy to finally have full legal custody, the fear that her ex had another plan up his sleeve still kept Sheila up at night.
Sheila was a nervous wreck.
And Alan being a very wealthy guy, and she was afraid of him.
He had lost. As we spoke with witnesses, it became clear that Mr. Blackthorne hated to lose.
Jamie and Sheila had quietly relocated the family to Florida.
Jamie was a pharmaceutical representative, and his company agreed to let him move his territory, and they saw an attorney to learn how to purchase that house without being a matter of public record. They were going almost to extremes to prevent anyone publicly from knowing where they were.
Despite their precautions, had Alan managed to locate his ex-wife?
Police contacted airlines and car rental companies to see if Blackthorne had been in the area recently, but they didn't come up with anything.
Placing him in Florida was a long shot at that point.
Sarasota investigators also reach out to authorities in Texas, who contact Blackthorne at his home in San Antonio on November 8, 1997.
He claims he had nothing to do with Sheila's murder, and he just found out about it on the news. Police said he didn't seem like he was trying to hide anything.
We found pretty soon that he was in Texas and couldn't have committed this crime.
But if Alan Blackthorne didn't kill Sheila, who did? Over the next 24 hours, investigators pieced together a series of clues.
They were canvassing the area, and they found an employee at a gas station who remembered a man coming in and asking for directions. The address that he was asking for was Mark Ridge, which is the neighborhood where Sheila lived. They also spoke with a neighbor who said they saw something strange around 9:15 a.m. on the day Sheila was killed.
There was a guy that happened to see a strange vehicle in the neighborhood.
The driver was a young man wearing camouflage.
This is a retirement community. Why would anybody be wearing camouflage outfit, combat boots in this neighborhood?
The witness doesn't know the stranger's identity, but he may be able to help investigators find the suspicious car.
He was able to actually give us a tag number, which was a huge break. And we did run that tag in Florida and got nothing, but we knew that they had just moved from Texas, and we ran that tag out of Texas, and it came back.
The vehicle is registered to a woman living in La Pryor, Texas, which is a small town just southwest of San Antonio. When police contacted the owner, she said her grandson was the person who primarily used the car, and his name was Jose Del Toro.
After a little digging, detectives learned that Del Toro is a small-time criminal from San Antonio.
He's in a work release program after a theft conviction, but he didn't show up that weekend.
We needed to talk to him. And in the meantime, Texas Rangers had located his vehicle and were sitting on it. We kind of thought there'd be a lot of valuable evidence in the car, but we needed some evidence to get a search warrant.
While Texas Rangers watched Del Toro's car, investigators in Sarasota contact local hotels, searching for evidence he'd been in the area.
They got a hit on the name at a hotel just a few miles away from the crime scene. Guest records show Del Toro stayed there on November 6th, the night before the murder.
He did use his own driver's license for ID.
Then, hoping to place Del Toro at the scene of the crime, investigators request a copy of his fingerprints from authorities in Texas.
The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office completed a one-to-one comparison of the prints from Jose Del Toro to the latent print that was lifted from the utility room, and they determined that it was a match to Jose Del Toro.
When we got that fingerprint hit, that was enough to get us a search warrant. And then when we did a search warrant on his car, we found the murder weapon. We found the receipt for the camouflage clothing that he bought right down the street from the crime scene. So we had a ton of evidence on him.
Coming up, investigators are convinced that they've found Sheila's killer. But they'll soon be wondering, was he acting alone?
When the conspiracy theory came out, then we knew we had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
Investigators in Florida have identified a prime suspect for the murder of Sheila Bellish, a small-time criminal from San Antonio, Texas, named Jose Del Toro.
We had his fingerprints at the crime scene.
Searching Del Toro's car, investigators also found the murder weapon and a receipt for the camouflage clothing witnesses described.
His vehicle was parked outside of one of his girlfriend's house down in San Antonio.
The girlfriend said she didn't know anything about Sheila's murder. She said Del Toro told her he was headed to Miami to make a drug deal. But she said if Del Toro was involved, his cousin Sammy would know about it.
Del Toro is still on the run, but on November 12, 1997, Texas Rangers locate his cousin, Samuel Gonzalez, and bring him in for questioning.
Tell me what you know about this incident.
Supposed to be just a beating and nothing about the killing was supposed to be occurred. And got to the point when I heard about that and saw the news and was kind of sad about it and disgusted about it.
Gonzalez tells investigators that his friend Danny Rocha had approached him a few months earlier with a job offer.
That's when the conspiracy theory came out, and then we knew we had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
He told us that he was asked to beat up Sheila, and he said, "I can't hit a woman."
Danny started talking about the money involved and said it could be as much as $10,000. And Sammy said he thought his cousin might be interested. His cousin was Joy Del Toro.
Those two traveled to the Bellish residence in Bernie, Texas. Timing was good for her. She got away.
They looked in the windows, and there was just very little bit of furniture. And so they reported to Rocha that it looked like no one was living there.
Heard she had just moved out of the States.
Gonzalez says Rocha had reached out to him again on November 5th with a new address for Sheila Bellish in Sarasota, Florida, and that he'd passed the information along to Del Toro.
Okay, so he's supposed to get down to Florida, punch her, and that's it. All right, what happens next?
Sammy claims that Del Toro came back on November 8th and told him that he had fired a gun at Sheila.
He said he shot her, but he didn't know if he hit her or not, and so I didn't kind of didn't want to hear about it. So.
He said he shot at her, but didn't know if he hit her?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
You mention anything about cutting her?
No, he didn't.
According to Gonzalez, killing Sheila wasn't explicitly part of the plan, but that he wasn't surprised it happened.
Danny had asked Joey to beat her up in a way that she was not able to take care of the kids. But he said that the best way to do it, just if you want to use 10 grand, is to kill her.
But when investigators ask Gonzalez if he knows where they can find Del Toro, he tells them that Sheila's killer has already fled to Mexico.
Joey is told by someone who had spoken to his grandmother that the police were looking for him, and he was wanted in connection with the murder of a woman in Sarasota. So he takes a bus to the border and walks across the border, and you know he's gone.
With Del Toro on the run, investigators focus on the men who allegedly hired him, and the man they suspect is behind it all, Alan Blackthorne.
Why would Danny Rocha? Why would Sammy Gonzalez? Why would Del Toro put a hit on Sheila in Florida? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. But if Mr. Blackthorne comes into the picture, it makes all the sense in the world.
Talking to associates of both Alan Blackthorne and Danny Rocha, investigators soon established that there is a connection between the two men.
Alan Blackthorne and Danny Rocha's relationship, everybody knew about it. They were big-ass golf buddies.
Danny Rocha was a very good golfer, not PGA quality, but he was a very good amateur golfer. And he gambled.
He was a golf hustler, and he would play golf with Alan Blackthorne and make a lot of money because he usually would win.
The bets were sometimes $1,000 a hole.
But we needed to get Danny Rocha to get to Alan Blackthorne.
Investigators suspect that Blackthorne had also offered Rocha 10 times that amount to get rid of his ex-wife.
It all came back pointing towards Alan Blackthorne.
Sammy Gonzalez's statement gives the authorities enough evidence to take the golf hustler into custody for conspiracy to commit murder on November 17th.
The Texas Rangers actually went to his house and arrested him, brought him to jail in San Antonio, and then we extradited him back to Sarasota.
Getting him to talk isn't as easy.
I sat in on some of the debriefings of Sammy and Danny, which could be brutally difficult.
We didn't get much from him.
Rocha refuses to flip on Blackthorne, but will the investigation be stalled for long?
November 20th, investigators find out that Del Toro's been arrested in Monterrey, Mexico.
Then we had to try to get him back from Mexico. And that turned into a political circus because at the time, Mexico would not let you extradite anybody out of there if you had a death sentence on the table.
Coming up, with Mexico being a possible dead end, investigators try a different approach and hit a new roadblock.
So I said, "You're going to get life in prison." And he said, "I'll roll the dice."
By mid-December of 1997, 1 month after the brutal murder of Sheila Bellish, authorities believe they are close to unraveling the conspiracy that led to her death. Suspected triggerman Jose Del Toro is in a Mexican jail, awaiting extradition.
All the politicians had to get involved and try to work out those details.
Samuel Gonzalez has already agreed to a plea deal for his role in the plot.
Sammy was just a big teddy bear. I don't think he would even get in a fist fight, so I think he got used in the whole process, to be honest with you. But he did get the best deal because he cooperated.
Alleged middleman Danny Rocha has refused to cooperate, but on December 16th, prosecutors charge him with criminal solicitation to commit capital murder and pressure him to turn on Sheila's ex, Alan Blackthorne, the alleged mastermind behind the murder.
I went to the jail and I interviewed him several times because we really wanted Blackthorne.
Eventually, between the jail interviews and statements Rocha makes to the media, investigators piece together what happened.
Danny was looking for some money, and he had some ideas in his head about how he might be able to start a business or whatever with Mr. Blackthorne. And Mr. Blackthorne started talking about Sheila and started talking about how bad of a person she was, how bad of a parent she was, and verbalizing that he would like to see something happen to her. He'd like to see her beat up and asking Danny about it.
Danny, in addition to making money, a lot of money, gambling on golf with Blackthorne, was a bookie. So apparently Alan thought that he had connections with unsavory underworld type people, but he really didn't. And so Danny asked Sam Gonzalez if he would get involved in having this ex-wife beaten up.
Before they could do it, Sheila and her family moved to Florida, which just made Alan even angrier.
Alan Blackthorne can't lose. No matter what he has to do, he's going to win. He had the mentality that he's rich and he's not going to lose his kids to anybody.
He hires a private detective to track Sheila down.
When she moved to Florida, he pursued her there. He was surveilling her. He was following her.
As soon as the private detective located Sheila, Blackthorne had gone back to Danny Rocha.
Blackthorne told Rocha that there'll be $50,000 in it if I get my children back. And Danny says, she'd have to be hurt pretty badly for you to get the children. And he said, that's fine. That conversation was repeated a couple of times. One time, Blackthorne said to him, look, the best way for them to do this is to kill her and dump her in the ocean or bury her in the woods.
One time, he made a statement. He wanted her thrown to the alligators.
With new marching orders from Blackthorne, Danny Rocha alerted Sammy Gonzalez, who contacted Jose Del Toro and set the whole plan in motion.
Del Toro drove basically straight through to Sarasota. He also, during that time, made dozens of phone calls on his cell phone.
He was a good-looking kid. He had a lot of girlfriends. He was on the phone with one or more of them throughout the trip. So that way we sent a subpoena to whatever cell phone company Del Toro was using for his cell phone. And using repeating towers, we were able to show the entire trip.
After Joey Del Toro butchered Sheila, Danny goes over to Blackthorne's house. And Danny says, yeah, they did it. I need some money to give to Del Toro, and I need $10,000. Blackthorne said, you guys fucked up. Because he had already heard that she had been found in her house. He knew before Rocha got there that Sheila had been killed. And she was found in the kitchen of her house. And he had instructed them to bury her in the woods or dump her in the ocean.
Despite being stiffed by Blackthorne, Rocha refuses to testify in court against his old golfing buddy.
The state of Florida, the Sarasota County District Attorney, was trying to coordinate with the Bexar County, Texas DA to work out a deal. They can't work it out. And his case went to trial.
So I said, you're going to get life in prison. And he said, I'll roll the dice.
When he goes on trial in January of 1999, the jury finds Danny Rocha guilty of first-degree murder. He's sentenced to life in prison.
Danny Rocha got exactly what he deserves. I think he'll die in prison.
However, Rocha's refusal to testify against him means that Alan Blackthorne remains free.
I think his wealth, maybe that gave him a sense of invincibility. He was out there after the murder and on like the evening news once in a while.
Blackthorne was so arrogant, it was irritating or aggravating. And he accused Jamie Bellish of being the cause, if not the actual murderer in the case. And frankly, it pissed us off.
Determined to get Blackthorne, investigators continue working the case. And in July of '99, make a major breakthrough.
Mexico agrees to extradite Del Toro and return him to Florida.
Coming up, with Del Toro's plea, only the alleged mastermind behind the murder remains at large. But will Alan Blackthorne ever face justice?
Sometimes if you got money, you can get away with substantial things.
In July of 1999, Florida authorities have finally apprehended the man who killed Sheila Bellish. 24-year-old Jose Del Toro.
He certainly wasn't a professional. He got into something way over his head.
After pleading guilty to Sheila's murder, Del Toro gives investigators a detailed confession.
What happened is that Jose Del Toro sat in the garage area for a bit until he felt comfortable enough to come into the house.
He was in the house for like an hour watching her, and he said he was getting ready to leave because he didn't want to do it, and she noticed him. When their eyes met, he panicked, and he said it was too late then. He had to go do what he had to
do. Del Toro's confession also implicates the man investigators believe is the mastermind behind Sheila's murder. Her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne.
He talked about how Blackthorne told him what a bad woman she was.
But even with Del Toro's confession, Blackthorne will be difficult to prosecute.
Texas has a code of criminal procedure. You cannot get a conviction based on an accomplice's testimony unless that is corroborated and links the defendant to the crime. And they tried every way they could to find that corroboration, but they were having trouble finding it. As time went on, it became more and more clear that they had a problem doing that, and that they might not ever get a conviction in state court, and that the proper venue for it would be federal court.
Prosecutors down in Texas, federal prosecutors, decided that there was a federal crime, planning a crime across state lines.
On January 4th, 2000, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Western Texas issues an arrest warrant for Alan Blackthorne.
Blackthorne was arrested in the parking lot of his country club.
We put him in the car, advised him of his rights, and then we took him down to the FBI office for being processed.
In June of 2000, Blackthorne finally stands trial for the murder of his ex-wife.
He was very cocky at the trial and was doing interviews with the press every day and thought it was a big joke. And he thought he was going to walk on this thing. But the two federal prosecutors were great. They did their homework.
The circumstantial evidence in this case was very, very strong. Mr. Blackthorne was a very controlling man. He was a man that was very angry about this divorce. He was very angry about the custody of his children. He was obsessed about it.
She eventually prevailed, moved away. He couldn't control her anymore. And that was a good part of our proof, good meaning large part of our proof at the trial to demonstrate why he would go to the trouble to have her killed.
Prosecutors also put the other members of the conspiracy on the stand, including Blackthorne's old golfing buddy Danny Rocha, who finally agrees to testify.
They were the witnesses that were going to make or break this case. If they were believed, we had a solid shot at obtaining a conviction and gaining justice. Their information had to be corroborated in state court, but it just had to be believed in federal court.
Will the jury believe them? On July 6th, 2000, they announced their decision.
The jury came back with guilty verdicts to both counts in the indictment.
It's taken almost 3 years, but the man most responsible for Sheila Bellish's death has finally been brought to justice.
But justice is an imperfect thing. Mr. Bellish will never get Sheila back. Sheila's gone forever. The kids had to live through this horrible nightmare.
But then you think about the emotional trauma of 4 children walking around their mother in the blood.
And then poor Stevie, 13 years old, came home from school and found her mother. It's heartbreaking. The damage and heartbreak that he caused all those people.
A tragedy like this is never forgotten. Jamie will never forget it, and the kids will, although they were quite young and won't remember it, they'll know of it, and they'll know what happened to their mother.
She was a great lady and a great mother. A lot of times, people that get murdered have a lot to do with why they got murdered. In this case, she did nothing. She was the most innocent victim you could find.
She was a gorgeous debutante with the world on a string.
She's a beautiful woman in the prime of her life. She really had no enemies.
Her family was well respected, as was she.
Until it was all suddenly taken away.
It was bad, you know. Beautiful entranceway to a beautiful townhome, and there she's laying covered in blood and roses.
This was a hit. This was an orchestrated hit.
The investigation would take detectives from a quiet bedroom community in Atlanta to the mansions of Palm Beach, Florida, to expose a killer desperate to be part of high society.
There's old money down there in Palm Beach. It's the rich and the famous.
I remember going to parties where there were bowls of cocaine.
When you have a lot of money, you can buy your way out of a lot of different things.
Friday, January 16th, 1987. It's a quiet morning in Atlanta's exclusive Buckhead neighborhood when shots ring out along a row of townhouses.
The police were called, and they responded almost immediately.
Officers arrived to find the door of one of the homes left open. Inside the foyer is the body of a 35-year-old woman. She's been shot twice in the head at point-blank range.
There was a box of roses in the foyer near 2 spent 9mm shell casings and a big pool of blood.
Shootings are uncommon in this upscale community, but police are even more surprised when the victim is identified as socialite Lita McClinton Sullivan.
Lita was such a sweet woman. She was very attractive, tall, beautiful smile, and very warm and very caring.
It really made no sense. She lived in a very nice part of town. She was doing all the right things as a human. She was a great human being. Why would someone want this beautiful woman in the prime of her life who was good to everyone? Why would they want him dead?
Born January 7th, 1952, Lita McClinton grew up among Atlanta's social elite.
She came from a very well-to-do family. Her mother was a state representative, and her father worked for the Federal Department of Transportation. Very upscale, white-collar people. And they lived in an old section of Atlanta, DeKalb County, Georgia. She attended college in the Atlanta area. I believe it was Spelman College.
She did go through debutante training and was a debutante and was a very elegant, beautiful, well-educated woman.
As a socialite, the next logical step was to find a suitable husband. But instead, Lita focused on building a career in fashion.
She just loved the retail business and fashion. And I think her aspiration was to run her own store one day. She was so busy that she was not dating. I never met anybody. Maybe she was just quiet about it and very private.
That all changed the day 34-year-old James Sullivan walked into her life in 1975.
Jim Sullivan was from the Boston area of Massachusetts. He grew up kind of scrappy and hard, for lack of a better term. But he inherited a great deal of money when his uncle died and left him a few liquor stores. The liquor store business drew him to Macon, Georgia, and eventually from Macon, he made his way to Atlanta, which is how he ended up meeting Lita.
Throughout that time period, he became friendly with a lot of the Atlanta socialites.
And he charmed her, evidently, in the store, and they started to date, and she was kind of head over heels.
According to Lita's friends, despite the 11-year difference in age, it was a classic case of opposites attract.
He had money, but was a little rough around the edges and came from Boston, which couldn't be more different than Atlanta, Georgia, especially during that time frame.
He was a terrible dresser, and I know that Lita changed that by just suggesting his ways. He was also very thrifty, so it was a hard job, but she got it done.
She loved that man, and there was something about him that appealed to her. Maybe it was the difference that drew her to him, but there's no logical explanation behind it. But I think the love between her and him was real.
After dating for only a year, Lita and Jim got married in 1976, settling into his house in Macon together. But Jim wanted more for himself and his new bride. He was a social climber who had his sights set on the exclusive island enclave of Palm Beach, Florida.
It's a very influential, very affluent area of Florida. It has lots of money, a lot of socialites.
And Jim had already found the perfect place. Casa Eleda, a historic beachside villa just down the road from Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort.
When Jim bought that big house, everybody noticed. And everybody wants to know who bought that house because it's right on South Ocean Boulevard. It's a beautiful Italian house. Lita thought that she could be very happy. I mean, what's not to love about beautiful homes? And it's a pretty place. I remember their first party where Alan and I were invited. The invitation came in a big piece of chocolate, hand-delivered, with the invitation, with the address and all that. He wanted to impress people in Palm Beach. It was his coming out party.
Around the same time, the couple bought a new townhouse in Atlanta. And for nearly a decade, the couple would split their time between Palm Beach and Buckhead.
She's an Atlanta girl through and through, so Lita wanted to come back home.
They bought a townhouse maybe a mile from where I lived, so I saw her often. But that was Lita's home base, and they went back and forth to Florida.
It seemed as though Lita was getting the best of both worlds, thanks to her husband.
I remember he bought her a Bentley, and I remember Lita would drive it, and then we would all jump in, and it was really a lot of fun. We'd go down Peachtree riding, like 6 of us all riding in this convertible. It was really fun.
She was happy, frequently seeing her family again and her friends, and was enjoying everything that life had for her at age 35.
But when Lita answered her doorbell that January morning, it all came to a bloody end. Now she lies dead in the foyer of her Midtown getaway, and investigators want to know why.
She wasn't a high-risk victim. She didn't do anything that would cause her to become a victim of a violent crime, such as this.
The first thing you ask yourself is, why is this person dead? Who wants this person dead? What is this murder all about?
Coming up, Lita's loved ones say her marriage wasn't everything it appeared to be.
When people knocked on the door, they thought that she was the housekeeper.
"35-year-old socialite Lita Sullivan has been murdered at her townhouse in Buckhead. Given its high-profile nature, the Atlanta Police Department puts its most decorated detectives on the case.
The lead detective was Welcome Harris, who was himself an icon of the civil rights movement and a very talented homicide detective and also a native Atlantan, who was one of the lead detectives on the Atlanta missing and murdered children's cases.
Early analysis of the crime scene indicates this isn't an attempted robbery, but an orchestrated murder.
There was a box of roses in the foyer near 2 spent 9mm shell casings and a big pool of Lita's blood.
It wasn't a burglary. The person didn't come in and ransack the house afterwards. The person came to the door. When she looked, it was just flowers that she could see. She opened the door. and he shot her point blank.
And so good morning was the last thing that Lita ever said. This was a hit. This was an orchestrated hit. She was lured to the door with flowers so that she could be shot in the head.
One of Lita's neighbors says he heard the gunshots, and when he looked outside, he caught a glimpse of the possible shooter.
There was a flower delivery individual. That individual shot and killed Miss Sullivan, and thereafter fled the area.
He was able to give a general description to the Atlanta Police Department, and they were able to do a composite sketch.
But if this was a professional hit, who sent the gunman? And why? Detectives' first call is to Lita's husband, Jim Sullivan.
James Sullivan was in Palm Beach, Florida, at Casa Lita when Lita was murdered.
He is shocked by the news and says he couldn't imagine who could ever want to hurt her. But Lita's devastated parents tell police there were plenty of people who wished her harm. In fact, that's one of the reasons why she'd gotten the house in Buckhead to begin with.
When Lita moved to Palm Beach, it was in the middle of the 80s, of 1980s. Palm Beach was a very white Anglo-Saxon place. If you go to some of the big parties, there are no black people.
The only time you see people of color are the landscape people and the butlers and things like that. It's an island full of mansions, and it's very exclusive.
She was having a hard time. She told me quite a few times that people were rude to her when she walked into a store. They were sort of surprised, like, who are you? And why are you here? Lita was not happy in Palm Beach. She felt like she wasn't treated, so she kept on coming back to Atlanta.
However, Lita's parents say that what concerned them most was the way James had handled the discrimination. When Lita told him she was unhappy, he didn't seem to care.
Like, what'd you bring me here for? I can feel it, I can sense it. I'm not welcome here. This isn't my world.
He didn't worry about Lita. He didn't listen that when people knocked on the door, they thought that she was the housekeeper. He didn't care about that.
On Palm Beach, they kind of excluded her from all the other things that were going on in Palm Beach. And he wanted to become a force in Palm Beach.
He wanted to impress people in Palm Beach. He wanted to take Palm Beach by storm.
I don't think that James Sullivan was welcomed as much as he probably wanted to be. He was trying to work his way into that, and I don't know if that worked out as well as he wanted.
Now you got two strikes against you. You're a white guy who's not blue blood money, you're more blue collar money, and you're married to an African American woman.
Lita's loved ones say that his behavior confirmed what they already suspected about the marriage.
There was tension in between James and his wife. We had received the same information that she had left and come back to the Atlanta area.
She didn't share a lot, but you could tell sometimes that she was by the sound of her voice, or when she'd call and say, let's get together. It was a hard time for her.
And it seems there was another reason for the split as well.
It would get back to me that he would be having lunch with some other woman at the Ritz-Carlton.
Lita Sullivan caught him having an affair, was sleeping with somebody in Palm Beach, and that was the last straw. He would embarrass her. She was ridiculed for being a black woman in Palm Beach, and that was the last straw. That's when she moved back to Atlanta.
When Jim started attending parties by himself, Lita had already made the decision that she was not staying.
Coming up, could Lita's murder be connected to her impending divorce?
The divorce was coming, but she hadn't yet dealt and told everybody. I mean, people knew, but it was a hard time for her.
Detectives investigating the murder of Lita Sullivan have a promising lead. It seems her marriage to millionaire James Sullivan was in trouble after she'd discovered he'd been cheating on her.
Palm Beach was where their relationship began to dissolve.
We invited him and Lita over for a small party we were having, and Lita and I were in the library, and Jim was in the living room, and he was asking another guest who was there to go out on a date with him. I think he just thought he could get away with anything.
The police soon discovered that infidelity is only one of James' many flaws.
I learned from her mother that, that they didn't like Jim Sullivan from the beginning. That there's just something about him.
I personally thought he was a phony, and he was a big talker and a big show-off.
I don't know of anybody that was close to him, or if he had any really close friends. Well, other than the women that he ran around with. He was very fond of prostitutes, and he did his own selfies long before our smartphones. He would just put a tripod up and take pictures of himself with these prostitutes and swimming in the pool and such. So he just wasn't a good person.
In the months leading up to Lita's murder, one of James' affairs had apparently become serious.
He became sort of like a couple with this Asian woman, Suki, who then became his date.
Suki and Sullivan began a relationship while he was still married to Lita. And after he and Lita separated, he began pursuing Suki seriously.
For Lita, it was the final straw. Soon after, she filed for divorce, but was gunned down before it could be finalized.
Lita came back to Atlanta and was living in Buckhead. And on the day of her murder, on January 16, 1987, there was a hearing scheduled in Fulton County Superior Court at 2 p.m. where the judge was going to make a final decision on their divorce. Lita had sought to invalidate the terms of their prenuptial agreement and was seeking a settlement. So that's what was on the table on the day that she was murdered.
The timing is incredibly suspicious, but James insists he had nothing to do with his wife's death. He and Lita signed a prenuptial agreement before their wedding 10 years prior, which means he had no financial motive. He thinks Lita was killed because she was living a dangerous double life of her own.
When Lita was killed, what his attorney and Jim made the public believe was that she was in drugs, that it was a drug deal, that it was an old boyfriend that got mad. They tried to ruin Lita's reputation.
Their angle was that it was drug dealers that did it, that she was involved with drugs, and that Jim Sullivan had nothing to do with it.
To Lita's loved ones, the idea that she could have been involved with drugs is ridiculous.
Oh my gosh, Lita didn't even hardly drink. She never did drugs. No.
The accusation adds to the tabloid nature of the story and earns James some new support.
Here in Palm Beach, they didn't really know Lita. They didn't know who her family was, so they basically came to his defense because they didn't know any better. Everything in the news that was printed and on television was that it was her fault. I mean, that's what happens to women. Even after we're dead, we got to prove that we're a nice person.
The media frenzy over the case winds up producing a new lead. Investigators get a tip about 3 suspicious men spotted at a motel near Lita's townhouse the day she was murdered.
They were able to track the killers back to this Howard Johnson motel that they had been in the day before.
And there's witnesses see 3 guys acting weird and getting in a car. It was a rental car, I think. And, they went to the flower store.
When investigators show the motel tipster the composite sketch, it's a match. on the hotel registry, they discover the three men had used fake names. However, phone records indicate they made several phone calls. All of them were to a number in Palm Beach, Florida.
They were in Howard Johnson's hotel room, 302, and there was a phone call from that hotel room to Jim Sullivan's house in Palm Beach. And the duration of the call was like 2 minutes or something.
It's enough to convince detectives that James Sullivan has been lying to them about his involvement in his wife's murder. But they still need proof.
It was a circumstantial evidence case. Jim Sullivan didn't pull the trigger. He was in hundreds of miles away in Palm Beach at the time.
Coming up, investigators get some help from an unexpected source.
They're getting divorced down here. She tells these stories like, I'm afraid of the guy.
Four months into their investigation, Atlanta police are zeroing in on a suspect in the murder of Lita Sullivan. They believe her estranged husband, James, may have hired a group of hitmen to kill her. James insists that their prenup means he had no motive, but detectives learn that might not have been the case.
She was trying to bust the terms of their prenuptial agreement in order to obtain more of his money that she felt that she was entitled to. He was not only adamantly opposed to it, but was very vocal in his strategy of scorched earth, that if he had to burn all of the assets before she got him, he would be willing to do that.
He didn't think he should have to share anything with Miss Sullivan through the divorce and was trying to preserve his wealth by having her murdered.
If the court ruled in Lita's favor, James stood to lose over $1 million.
She wanted to keep the townhouse in Atlanta. She wanted her car, which was a little two-seater Mercedes, which was not a new car, and she wanted her jewelry. But Jim wanted the jewelry, he wanted the townhouse, and he wanted the car. He wanted everything. He wanted her to walk away with nothing. It was worth $1 million, the settlement. That's all it was.
However, motive is only one piece of the puzzle. Other than a few suspicious phone calls, investigators don't have any solid evidence linking him to the crime. And as the months go on, the chances of finding that proof grow further out of reach.
The Atlanta Police Department in 1987 looked high, looked low, did everything they could in an attempt to solve Lita's murder and could not. They couldn't piece it together.
It was nothing that the Atlanta police did or didn't do that caused the case to go cold. I mean, I think they did an excellent job from the onset. There was a lot of obstacles, and there was no cooperation, obviously, from Jim Sullivan.
In the meantime, James has continued to climb the social ladder in Palm Beach.
After Lita was murdered, he was free, of course. So not only did he not have to pay Lita anything after she was murdered, but he was free to marry Suki.
She was enamored with him because he came across the same way he did with Lita, charming.
But in 1989, a routine traffic stop would cause him to lose it all.
He was driving the car, it was the Mercedes or the Rolls Royce, whatever, but he was involved in a minor traffic accident.
He's not supposed to be driving. He doesn't have a license. The tag's on his car. He's so cheap he doesn't even keep the tags current. So he gets a couple citations. He goes to court. The cop doesn't show up. So he gets Suki to testify, Your Honor, I was driving. So they threw the case out. Well, wouldn't you know, a Palm Beach Post reporter, he's in court that day because he's kind of watching Sullivan too. He gets back to his office and calls the police officer and says, hey, I know you didn't come to court today, but Sullivan had his wife testify that she was driving. He had her stand up in court and swear under oath. Now the cop's hot, so he goes to the state attorney and they start this investigation.
They wind up convicting him of perjury and he takes a plea, and he was restricted to house arrest for, I guess, a year.
At the same time, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has obtained a warrant to search James and Suki's home.
GBI came down here. He sees a gun in the house. He gets charged with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon.
They found 4 weapons. One sort of shotgun, which he was not permitted to have while under house arrest.
The gun charge, as well as Suki's false testimony, gives detectives some new leverage in their murder investigation.
They charged Suki with perjury. Now she's freaking out because she's got a felony charge, and so now they're really split.
She just felt like that was just wrong. She didn't do anything, and he was the one that should, face the court.
In 1990, Suki files for divorce and agrees to testify against James. She winds up giving investigators more than they could have ever hoped for.
She says Sullivan basically didn't confess, but said Lita's murder is good for us, which is kind of unusual, you know, telling a woman, my wife was murdered, and it's going to be good for us.
That exclamation caused an intense national publicity.
With Suki's sworn testimony, prosecutors have what they need to present their case against James Sullivan to a grand jury.
He was arrested shortly after that point.
Coming up, charging a multimillionaire with murder is one thing. Convicting him is another.
He hired a big-time Washington, D.C. lawyer, and they shut us down.
Five years after the murder of Lita Sullivan, investigators have finally arrested her ex-husband James for planning the crime.
The feds had indicted Sullivan for interstate commerce for committing a crime, namely using the phones to set up this hit, murder. The main witness at the 1992 federal trial was Suki Sullivan. Suki doesn't want to take the hit for him anymore.
But as the trial begins in June of 1992, it quickly becomes clear that their case still isn't strong enough. James has hired an expensive and effective legal team who turned the testimony of his latest ex-wife into a disaster for the prosecution.
Upon cross-examination, she fell apart. They didn't have enough to really nail her, but they had enough to dirty her up really badly, that she was just out to get money from Sullivan.
She pretended that she wasn't understanding or able to read English. She pretended that she was frightened of Mr. Sullivan. And those pretensions by her turned out to be completely false, at least from the court's perspective when the court entered the final judgment.
He was acquitted by a judge. It was a directed verdict in federal court. And he was free after that and just remained at large.
Even if James did hire hitmen to get rid of Lita, it looks like he's going to get away with it. But Lita's well-connected parents decide to take matters into their own hands with a civil lawsuit.
They were looking to sue Sullivan for wrongful death. I think they were a little frustrated with the Atlanta prosecutors. And so we spoke for a while, and I said I'd be happy to take it on. I'm not a lawyer, so I got a good friend of mine who was practicing civil law at the time, Brad Morris, to take a look at it.
James doesn't seem to take the suit seriously, choosing to skip the high-priced lawyers this time.
He fired his attorney and he defended himself.
Mr. Sullivan determined that he would represent himself before the jury and argue his own defense as to why the issues brought by the estate of Lita Sullivan should not be accepted by the jury.
The move immediately backfires.
We go to court and, we really smoked the guy.
There was a judgment against Mr. Sullivan on behalf of the estate of Lita Sullivan for approximately $6 million.
While James has been found legally responsible for his wife's death, it still doesn't guarantee justice.
Lita's parents won a judgment against him, wrongful death. He never paid it. He never ever had any intention of paying 1 cent to anybody.
He was hiding money all over the place. They never collected a penny because they couldn't find it.
He was a criminal. That's how he was brought up. And he was a nasty man.
For the next several years, no criminal charges are placed for Lita's murder, and James Sullivan's notoriety continues to grow.
He always wanted to be in the newspapers, on TV, be talked about. Well, guess what? His wish came true, because now he's in the papers, he's on TV, he's being talked about, and not in a good way.
However, the national publicity would eventually provide detectives with a new lead.
Years later, I think it was America's Most Wanted, did a TV show based on the murder of Lita Sullivan.
In 1998, a woman named Belinda called the GBI and said that she had some information about the murder of Lita in Atlanta in 1987.
She's watching this show and she sees his picture and says, "Oh my God, this guy gave my ex-boyfriend a bag of cash."
She's living in Texas, hasn't seen Harwood in years. He knocks on her door and said, "Oh, I'm just passing through Texas and I thought I'd say hello." This was right after the America's Most Wanted had the Lita murders case on television. This woman had also seen that show. She is wigged out. She thinks Harwood's going to kill her.
For investigators, this cold case has suddenly heated back up.
One of the things that we all had a duty to do was to make sure that she was telling us the truth. And in order to do that, you have to corroborate and investigate every aspect of what she told us. And the GBI, they teamed back up with the Atlanta Police Department. One of the things that she told them was that Tony Harwood had met Jim Sullivan when he was working as a mover for a trucking company. So they went to that company and they were able to locate the original contract from November of 1986, where Tony Harwood, in fact, moved some furniture into Jim Sullivan's home in Palm Beach.
Investigators quickly tracked down Tony Harwood in North Carolina. To their surprise, he seems to be waiting for them.
When they knocked on the door, he said something like, "I was wondering what took you so long."
He admitted to them that he met Jim Sullivan and that Jim Sullivan had hired him to kill his estranged wife and offered to pay him $25,000 to kill Lita. He confirmed that he was in Atlanta at the time that Lita was murdered, but he denied ever pulling the trigger and instead blamed another individual. After they were able to corroborate not only what Belinda said, but what Tony Harwood said with independent evidence, contracts, phone records, other witnesses, they then issued an arrest warrant for Jim Sullivan.
He was re-indicted in Fulton County for the murder of Lita Sullivan.
In most cases, double jeopardy would prevent James from being tried again for the same crime. But it seems he's unwilling to take that chance.
When they attempted to bring him in, Jim Sullivan had already gotten word that there was a warrant for his arrest, and he fled.
He took his passports and left. He got out of the U.S.
Coming up, an international manhunt begins, with James one step ahead of investigators.
He fled from Florida to Costa Rica, and from Costa Rica, he went on a worldwide tour.
An accomplice's confession has given prosecutors another chance to convict James Sullivan. But before he can be arrested, James flees the country. The search continues for several years, but James continues to evade capture. So in 2002, the FBI tries enlisting the aid of the public.
At that time, America's Most Wanted was very popular. We used them as a very good investigative tool to assist us in trying to find people. That night that it was featured, I was there at America's Most Wanted answering phone calls. We started getting a lot of phone calls saying he's in Thailand.
Thailand police immediately placed James under arrest, but the wheels of international justice turn slowly. It takes 2 more years for James to be extradited back to the United States. In the meantime, prosecutors used the delay to prepare their case.
We did everything we could to round up the witnesses, interview the witnesses, prepare the witnesses, prepare our physical evidence, make sure we had everything tested and everything investigated. We had to go about finding people and interviewing people who hadn't spoken of her murder for years, decades. Tony Harwood entered into a negotiated plea with the state of Georgia, and what he agreed to do was to serve 20 years in prison for his role in the death of Lita in exchange for testifying against Jim Sullivan at trial.
It probably prevented him from getting the death penalty.
When James arrives in 2004, his attorneys immediately file a motion to dismiss the charges. It goes all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court for a decision.
He tried to block his trial by saying double jeopardy, that the federal government had prosecuted him for this crime already and he had been acquitted, and therefore the state of Georgia could not try him for this crime. He lost that appeal to the Supreme Court.
In 2006, 19 years after Lita was assassinated, James Sullivan finally stands trial in Georgia. Although prosecutors have first-hand testimony from one of the hitmen James hired, the defense argues that there is no actual evidence he was involved.
We could never place any firearms, at least a 9mm, in Harwood's possession. Never got any hits back on the shell casings. He says that, he threw it out the window for the guy. I think he said his name was Bob or something.
The defense blamed it all on Tony Harwood. Basically, Harwood is a liar, and you can't believe anything he has to say, and the state just didn't prove their case. And they're just blaming Sullivan because he's the usual suspect, the estranged ex-husband.
But the state's case proves strong enough to prevent James from escaping for a second time.
Ma'am, would you publish the verdict?
It took the jury a few hours to deliberate. We, the jury, find the defendant, James Vincent Sullivan, guilty of malice murder. And find Jim Sullivan guilty of Lita's murder. Then the jury affixed the penalty at life without the possibility of parole.
Everybody was elated, especially the family, all the people that worked so hard on the investigation, the Atlanta Police Department, the GBI, everybody that was involved with this.
When I heard the verdict, I thought that show-off of a man who only talked about all the places he had and he lived and the clothes he had, now is going to have to spend the rest of his life in this prison, in this beat-up old uniform.
It seems a fitting end for such a notorious social climber. The same callousness and greed that drove James to have Lita killed wound up putting him in jail for the rest of his life.
Jim killed Lita because he couldn't part with 1 cent. She was not going to get that condominium, that car, and the jewelry. It was just power. It was just power and greed. That's all. She was not going to win.
Justice was served. I'd have much rather Mr. Sullivan receive the death penalty because of what he did. But him staying in jail for the remainder of his life doesn't bring back Miss Sullivan.
And I always think of the possibilities of the woman she could have been. She would be about 68 now, I believe. What she could have done, she would have remarried, had children. I mean, that's what she wanted. She never got to fulfill all her dreams.
There may be some money out there. The best vengeance was to get that money and then give it to the McClintons to donate somewhere, because I'm sure they'd donate it. That would be the best vengeance for me anyways.